This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Thanks for joining us on this episode. Our guest today is a counterterrorism expert, Mark Fallon. Mark has an incredible 31-year career of government service, filling several roles in the fight against terrorism. Mark has served as the deputy commander of the Criminal Investigation Task Force at Guantanamo Detention Camp, commander of the USS Cole Task Force, and the former chief of counterintelligence operations for Europe, Africa, and Middle East divisions. Mark also served as the director of NCIS, the Training Academy, assistant director at FLETC, and has contributed in a variety of ways to the ongoing education and investigative interviewing. He also served in roles with the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, International Association of Chiefs of Police, and a well-known steering committee that helped develop the Mendez Principles. Continuing his career in the private sector as a consultant, an expert witness, and has authored or contributed to several books, which we are going to discuss on this episode. It's with this incredible experience that we'll learn how effective communication strategies and interrogation tactics have helped to improve policing across the globe and protect national security. Welcome to this episode of Truth Be Told. I am your host, Dave Thompson, and I am here with a counterintelligence expert, a leader in investigative interviewing standards, and a good friend, Mark Fallon. Thanks for joining me today, Mark.
Dave, thanks for having me on.
I know we're gonna dive into a ton of experience you've had in your career, from investigating some pretty high profile counterterrorism investigations and cases, and your impact on training and interview standards across the globe. But I thought it would be interesting just to kind of first kick off with a little bit of understanding of what your early career looked like with NCIS, and kind of your exposure to what was interviewing like then versus what you might know now.
Yeah, it's tough to remember back that far, Dave, but let me give it a shot. Coming into federal law enforcement, I first came in 1979 as a deputy U.S. Marshal, and then to NCIS in 1981. And at that time, NCIS was called NIS, the Naval Investigative Service. And before that, it used to be called the Office of Naval Intelligence, because the organization was a counterintelligence organization that evolved to become a criminal investigative organization. And so the culture is kind of a blended culture, unlike many other in federal law enforcement, obviously. And so my early training was both in criminal investigations and counterintelligence. And the criminal investigations piece of the mission was very much a confession-driven methodology. And the objective was to gather as much information, as thorough an investigation as possible. And the last step would always be to allow the suspect to tell their side of the story or to confess to the crime. And our training was that, people want to confess, you just have to make it available for them to confess.
Right.
And it was very much investigators' bias, because I built my case. And oftentimes I went in there, and when I hear some of the training, it says, don't, there's a presumption of innocence. Yeah, yes, in court, obviously. But if I've just purchased 2 kilos of cocaine from you, and then I want to talk to you after I take the handcuffs off, I have a presumption that you just did the crime because I was there at the time. And so
right. It's a little different.
It's kind of interesting when I hear some of the training where they try to say, just, avoid that. And it's not possible to do so in some of the cases. But so what I found, however, is that as NCIS mission is also counterintelligence, a lot of those objectives are to develop assets. right? And so if you're working a case, it could be an espionage case or some less loss. And so what you're always looking to do was make an assessment whether that person could be an asset for the organization. And now it's termed offensive counterintelligence operations. We used to call it double agent operations back in my day. And so you had an organizational culture that was a hybrid. If you're working criminal investigations, you were seeking to get the confession, to get the case to court, whether it be courts martial or state, local court, or federal court. Or if you have your other mission hat on, you're looking at collecting information. My techniques evolved to be a blend of those, to be a hybrid. Because early in my career, I worked a lot of undercover narcotics operations, a lot of out-country operations, being undercover in Thailand or Kenya or the Philippines or all over the world. And of course, you're buying the drugs from a dealer at one level, and you're interested in going up to the next level. If you're working a fraud case, white collar crime, you may have a suspect at one level, but you may want to get up the rungs in the organization to show the organization has institutional issues with it. And so my practice evolved to be more what we termed early in my career relationship building techniques. And so the goal was to go in there and build some type of relationship with that person, which we now call rapport, so that it would be easier to get information from that person. And what I found early on was that the sterner I was, if that's a word, right? The harsher I was, the more hard ass agent I was, the more resistance I encountered. And I found that the more respectful I was, that respect was returned. And I learned this early on, just doing street buys of drugs. I working with Brooklyn South Narcotics when I started in New York City or wherever. But if you had an informant buy the drugs and then you want to make an arrest and you tell the informant to run, everybody runs. So I learned to tell the asset to don't run, just put your hands up, and then everyone will mimic that behavior.
Right.
And so what I found is that kind of translated into the interrogation room, where if I treated someone respectfully, they were more respectful to me.
Yeah, I think what's crazy about that is what a simple concept it is, but how it's really difficult for people to comprehend. Which is why I'm excited talking with you, because we've got people listen that might have employee relations investigations, criminal investigations, or maybe just business conversations. And a lot of times people think, well, if I've got a really difficult case, meaning the crime is of high magnitude or violent crime, or I'm talking to somebody who's, a hardened criminal in air quotes, I need to be more direct and more harsh with them. But I mean, based on some of the cases we'll talk about today, your experience at Guantanamo and the USS Cole bombing and the investigations of people who, obviously from the outside looking in, might be pretty difficult to talk to. You're saying that rapport is just as important in those cases.
Rapport is essential in those cases. Yeah, and
Yeah, and I
I'll
think
give you an example, Dave, of a debriefing I did once of an emir of a Jamaat Islamiyah, which is affiliated with Al Qaeda in Southeast Asia, training camp, who helped instruct bombings. His name was Nasser Abbas, and I talked to him about when he was arrested by Detachment 88, Densus 88 in Indonesia, why he gave information up. I was trying to look at what his counterinterrogation strategies may be. And he said, I was treated with, I thought I'd be tortured, and I wasn't. And I was treated with respect. And as a Muslim, I had to return that respect to them. I was obligated to return that hospitality to them. And that's another thing that we said, post kind of USS Cole or post 9/11, when I was conducting investigations of the suspects in those matters, was that when you go in, if they do have some type of counter resistance training and you go in there and you are respectful to them, that dislodges those expectations. And if you dislodge those
Right.
expectations, they may look at you differently. And oftentimes I found that with me, that's what has occurred. And so even if it's a hardened street criminal who may not have a good relationship with law enforcement in their area, if you go into them and treat them respectfully, it's a way to counter their resistance strategies and kind of disarm them because you've dislodged their expectations of what they think might happen to them in the interrogation room.
That's a good point, right? People, they're entering just like the investigators entering with bias that, hey, I'm going to talk to bad guy, right? And the person entering the interrogation or the interview is thinking, I got to go talk to this cop, this investigator, this whoever it is who's out to get me, and all the things that I've seen and experienced, and now I have to counter that. What you're saying is it's almost, it seems counterintuitive, but if you enter this conversation unexpectedly respectful and empathetic, and developing a relationship, that makes it more difficult for their strategies. I think that's an important takeaway, especially coming from your perspective. But other question I have with that, I think about developing rapport with, maybe like at a networking event or meeting somebody for the first time, and maybe I don't want to develop rapport, but I kind of have to. So you got to find something that's in common, or you have to figure out a way to connect. And I think a lot of interviewers struggle with developing rapport genuinely and with sincerity, and not being completely fake. But if you're doing a counterintelligence type investigation, you're probably talking to somebody you don't have much in common with. So what does that look like? What's the difference between, I have something in common versus actual rapport or relationship building?
Well, we do have a lot in common, whether we realize it or not. We are generally born of parents, right? We
Right.
may have siblings, some degree of education. We generally love our parents. Our parents love us. We go through life, whether you're, from China, Russia, the Philippines, or Pakistan. I mean, you're often part of a family unit. You have relationships with people, and so there's more in common than you might think. They may not be a Buffalo Bill or New York Giant football fan,
Right. It's not
but
a
there's
crime yet.
yeah yeah you can find some type of common ground as a human being. What one of the early studies that I was privy to, and we may get to this. At one point, I was the chair of the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group Research Committee, but I was part of some research project that my alma mater, Roger Williams University, was involved in, and this was a Higgs sponsored research project, where they wanted to go out and talk to people who've done a lot of interrogations and then people who've done high value interrogations. And they had coded surveys and recorded interviews. And I mean, I was interviewed, went to a hotel room and was interviewed, controlled conditions. And what I was really found interesting were the results of it. And when they asked either group, people who've done a lot of interrogations or people who've done high value target interrogations, and they were asked what the number one trait you should look for in an interrogator, the answer was empathy. So the community involved in this understands the importance of that. The other piece that I found kind of fascinating was that there's a thing called the Army Field Manual for military interrogators that are with, predominantly Army. It's trained at Fort Huachuca, an Army intelligence school there. NCIS doesn't go through that. At least certainly didn't during my time. We used a federal law enforcement standard, but they are trained in coercive techniques. They are trained in being harsh. They are trained in a lot of methods that wouldn't fly in law enforcement in any type of federal or state court or military court, frankly. But when they interviewed those individuals who had the training in the more coercive tactics, they said when they got to the field, they discarded those coercive ones and gravitated towards the rapport building or relationship type techniques they were taught because that's what they found to be effective. And I've often
Right.
challenged the Army that if when they get to the field, they're abandoning those practices, why are you wasting time teaching them when you could use that same time to hone the skills and the practices that they are actually finding effective? And then subsequently, that research has said are more effective than the old methodologies.
Yeah, that's a good example of what what we think might work based off of just kind of maybe a gut feeling or too many people watching TV versus what actually works in the field. And when we say works, I think it's defining, operationalizing that, right? What is a successful interview or interrogation? And it's gaining actionable intelligence versus, as you mentioned before, this kind of confession seeking, almost a one stop shop. And that's the end of the relationship. And now I know we mentioned a little bit about this, but I would think when you have some really high profile investigations that impact public safety, the safety of a country, of globally even, um, there's probably some extra pressure, urgency, immediacy to the interviewer, and so I would imagine that's when a lot of times you see investigators resort to more coercive tactics. And you've had some leadership roles in the investigation of the USS Cole, the Cole bombing. Um, I was reading about you were involved in the investigation of the blind sheik, and then obviously your experience at Guantanamo. So you got some pretty high pressure interrogations where there's a large amount of safety, public safety, kind of under your umbrella. How does that translate to the urgency that investigators felt and the resort to coercive tactics there?
Yeah, well, some of the things I learned. I used to be a hostage negotiator trainer, and when emotions are high, rationality is low, right? And
Right.
so it's very important to diffuse the internal tension, right? To depressurize the environment so there's more clarity in the decision making processes to start with. And because I've probably said, I'd like to get in the room with that guy, right?
Right.
Or whatever. You're mad, you're angry. I mean, I've worked cases on pedophiles and child abusers and rapists and murderers and terrorists and things like that. And what you have to kind of shift your mindset that unlike the TV shows or the movies where the detective, the investigator, the agent is a judge, jury, and sometimes executioner, right? They're the ones that are going to get justice by meting out some type of punishment. That's not the role of a professional in this business. We, under the rule of law, there are juries and judges that will evaluate that information. And so you need to go in with the mindset that your job is getting accurate, reliable information so that informed decisions can be made. And those decisions can be your decision about where you go with your case. It could be for your supervisor to make an informed decision about where to go with that case or other cases. A business leader, what processes or practices they might want to change in the corporate world. So if you look at it more that your job is to elicit information gathering, rather than confession driven, you will get more data and you will be able to make a more informed decision. You'll make a better case. And the challenge with it, Dave, is that the confession driven practices have proven to be very effective in obtaining a confession from a guilty person.
Right.
However, they're also prone to obtain confessions from innocent people. And when I talk to police chiefs or sometimes legislators, I talk about the fact that, I was trained and I believed an innocent person wouldn't confess to a crime they didn't commit. I believed that. I was wrong. I was ignorant of what was out there, and we were all wrong. We all believed that at the time, I could say. It really wasn't until DNA came out, and the physical science of DNA has revolutionized policing. As an investigator, the way I would work a crime scene now that we know about DNA is much different than I was just looking for fingerprints or the old days when fluorescent powder was the big advancement rather than just the
Right.
the gray, black, and white stuff. Um, and so as you look at kind of how these advancements move forward, it's how do you then apply them? And so the body of research available today in the psychological sciences has yet to be embraced with the same level of vigor as those of the physical sciences of DNA, of things like that. A friend of mine who was at Abu Ghraib and practiced some coercive and torture on detainees, and he was a former police officer, and he talked about his time at the academy, where he said he got 2 weeks of training in the motor vehicle code and an hour of interview training. And then he gets picked as an expert, as a contractor, to go to Abu Ghraib because of his experience, as a police officer with this hour of interrogation training. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the challenge, is that we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, Mark, we've actually had a lot of guests on the show from different law enforcement agencies, federal agencies, where they have a consistent kind of recollection of their interview training, which was bare minimum or none.
Yeah.
But then they were told to go out in the field and do it. And I think it seems like you've had that same experience, at least with some colleagues you worked with.
Yeah. And the challenge is that if people do things a lot, they think they're an expert. And experience does matter. But it also matters if you've been doing it wrong a lot and you've honed these inept practices or tactics that may have gotten you success, but you may not be aware of the times when they've been misapplied. And that's what I'm
Right.
sure that I was shocked when I learned about all these false confessions, because I didn't think they were real. Right? I thought,
Right.
that, oh, the person's just recanting after the fact, because, and you find out that, particularly the fact that, could depends on when you look at the research, 1/4 to 1/3 of those people exonerated by DNA, I mean, court ordered exonerations, had falsely confessed to crimes they didn't commit. And this is
Right.
only the ones that they had enough evidence to overturn it with DNA. So, I mean, if you
Right.
can
Yeah.
imagine all those people who accepted plea agreements and other things to avoid longer jail sentences, who may have confessed to a crime that they didn't commit. And so, we're a very high on the incarceration rate in this country, one of the highest in the Western world, and it's troubling as a career law enforcement officer, the son of a deputy police chief. My nephew's a detective in New Jersey now. My father-in-law was my father's partner. My brother-in-law was a police officer. So I'm from a blue blood family, to kind of now realize that there has been some inept practice out there that has contributed to miscarriages of justice. And we need to kind of embrace that, and kind of recognize that, we didn't know things then that we know now. And I'm not trying to make
Right.
excuses for then, but you can rationalize how those things happened in the past. We cannot anymore.
Yeah.
The data is
Yeah. When
there.
you
We
mentioned,
know it works.
yeah, and you mentioned a couple of things that I want to expand on, and I was just thinking when you talked about experience doesn't necessarily mean expertise. I think about my golf game. I've golfed for quite a long time, and nobody should ever watch me as a role model for how to replicate their swing. And I probably got bad habits from whoever I learned from. And it's I think, okay, well, I made a good shot, right, a good drive. So whatever I did must have been right. But I don't really know what that was. Maybe I got lucky, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it was just whatever happened that day. And so I think reflection is really difficult for people and important. But when you talk about what is expertise, and we don't know what we know until maybe it's too late, unfortunately. When you had some time Guantanamo and in that kind of counterintelligence, counterterror space, and I know you deserve a ton of credit for the courage you have and had to stand up against enhanced interrogation techniques or torture when you saw that there were some issues with that. And I recommend people to get your book, Unjustifiable Means, which explains a ton of your experience. But I don't know if you can expand a little bit on maybe what you saw there as it relates to our conversation of there's techniques that are being suggested to being used by so-called experts. But what were they really resulting in? Are we getting intelligence? Are we getting information? Is it reliable? And what does that look like?
Yeah, let's step back there to high pressure situations. And when you're being told that our national security depends on what you do, right? We need to bring these terrorists to justice. We need to find out about what other attacks might be out there. Are there different terrorist cells? Are there sleeper cells? Things like that. So it is a high pressure and intense situation. I was detailed from NCIS to Army CID, reporting directly to the Office of Secretary of Defense to be the chief investigator for the Al Qaeda terrorist network for trials before military commissions. And so I had, frankly, felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. And when I was detailed to the Army from NCIS, my boss in NCIS, a good friend of mine, Ralph Blenko, who was the deputy director, basically told me, "You cannot fail. This is too important. Whatever resources you need, let us know. But you cannot fail in this mission." And we failed. We failed because people tried to embrace a family of interrogational abuses, which they thought would produce accurate, reliable information. And people generally equated it to the fact that I've had neighbors tell me, "Well, if you tortured me, I'd tell you anything you wanted to know." Well, that's the
Right.
point. It's not what I want to know; it's what's the truth is. And so the challenge then, Dave, was because and thank you for acknowledging my role there in Unjustifiable Means. But I don't view myself as this whistleblower who saw this and did it. I viewed this as I was a federal agent with a sworn duty to protect and preserve the Constitution. And I saw people, particularly in the military, who were about to commit what I knew were war crimes. So I was basically doing my job. And when I opposed it, it wasn't as an individual. It was as the deputy commander of the CITF. It was as someone with an NCIS at the deputy assistant director level. That challenge was backed by NCIS and all the way up to the general counsel for the secretary of the Navy. And so there was an institutional pushback against devolving to coercive methods because I view them as illegal, immoral, ineffective, and inconsistent with American values. Right? I mean, when you take a look at what you did, and we were concerned when I was asked to help form this task force, the CITF, Criminal Investigation Task Force. We were concerned that emotions would be high. We were concerned that individual agents would want to seek retribution on their own. And so we gave specific training. We gave training in Nuremberg. We trained our people that they must not follow an illegal order. And if they saw those things, they must be challenged. And I told them, even if you see me going down that road, you have an obligation to challenge me to ensure that I don't get off track here, because I'm subject to those same pressures, right? I'm subject to the same emotions.
Right.
Now, fast forward to those incredible battles that I had, political battles in the halls of the Pentagon, where I was fighting against the CIA's narrative that torture worked, that this family of interrogational abuses, not just torture, but a whole series of these abusive practices that worked. And I was trying to challenge that based on my experiences, my golf game, right? My experience says this. My lawyers are telling me this. When we worked on the coal, we had good results doing this. I worked on the blind shake, so I've been kind of involved with particularly Al Qaeda for a little while now, and I was not listened to. Right, the powers that be felt the CIA and their secrets that they couldn't tell anybody, which we know were all lies, from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to Torture report. But I didn't have the research that's available today then. And I know in 2000, I was asked to speak in New York City at the United Nations General Assembly. And what I had said there is that if I knew the research that we have available today, then I may have been more persuasive in being able to alter the course of history to dissuade, particularly the Department of Defense, from embracing this family of interrogational abuses that the CIA was using and got them in so much trouble.
Right.
So now today, and this is what's a bit frustrating as a career law enforcement officer and an interrogation professional, is that if you go to you could pick the city or the town, and you ask who's their interrogation expert, they'll basically pick some investigator who has had success in their golf game, right? They've had, and so they're their expert interrogation. Well, there have been over one taxpayer sponsored research projects that have resulted in more than 2 peer reviewed publications in scientific journals. And if you ask that expert which of that research they've read, they'd likely say none. Right.
Right.
And so the community of practice is totally unaware of the current scholarship, of the scholarly knowledge that can be applied to improve their practice.
Right.
And that's
Well,
often what I try to do, is try to get these two independent silos to work together to embrace it, because now that I know the research, I train differently. My practice is different, and I know that some of the things that I was practicing before have been validated by the science. I know why being empathetic now works, right? I know this rapport is now scientifically grounded, where for me it was just what I naturally evolved to, but there is now science to validate why that is effective. There's also some things that I will never do again, right? I will alter my practice now because I know that there are unintended consequences that might come from that. I don't need to do that because these other methods that avoid doing that are actually more effective than that other method. And that's the hard part, particularly for police who are under the gun now, right? There's a lot of criticism. Communities have lost trust in policing. We're having problems with recruitment and retention of police officers, and I think we need to restore that trust. But by doing so, I mean, as you know, and you are a great supporter of banning deceptive police practices, right? I and you don't believe that there should be a culture of lying in a police department. Right now, I've worked undercover. I'm not talking about undercover ops and things like that, but I'm talking about once a
Right.
person's arrested and in custody, and in the interrogation process, once they're in that pipeline, then we should be avoiding these deceptive practices. One, because it has haphazard results, right? There are unintended consequences. You wouldn't issue a weapon to a police department that haphazardly misfires and hits unintended targets. You should not do so with your interrogation practice because it's not necessary, right?
Right.
If you evolve and learn the information gathering methods that you are now teaching, that I am teaching, that I advocate for, you will be more effective because you'll obtain more admissions, more overall information, and less false or fabricated or erroneous information. And you'll trigger better memories because that's what you're trying to really probe oftentimes. It's not just the confession, but you're trying to get someone to remember details because as an investigator, I'm not just looking at the crime. What are the elements of that offense? Because that's what a prosecutor is going to have to make sure is met. Were the elements of that offense met in that particular investigation? And so you're looking to probe that memory, whether it be a source, an asset, a witness, a victim, or a suspect. You're trying to get them to look backwards. And so you need to set the conditions where memory will be most effective. And it is not when you're under stress. It is not when you're fearful. It is not when you're under that pressure. And so, what I advocate is kind of depressurizing the environment and the internal pressures on that person to be truthful will likely increase.
Yeah, I think, and there's kind of two last areas I want to explore. I want to get into a quick overview of a book that just came out that I know you spearheaded a collective group of incredible experts and authors who are bringing science into practice, which is really important because a lot of practitioners, it's not just that they don't want to know the research, is that they can't access it. They maybe don't understand where to get it, or they have to pay to access it. And you've helped to kind of overcome that. But one of the things in the book I'm referring to, I've got it here with me. If those of you watching, you can see it, but it's free electronically. So I'll let Mark speak to that, the digital version. But it's Interviewing and Interrogation, a review of research and practice since World War II. And one of the many chapters that are in here talks about false confessions. And one of the and jurors' perceptions of false confessions and kind of lay people's perceptions of them. One of the kind of contributors to a false confession is misclassification, which is, how did the wrong person get put into the box per se, right? And get accused of something in the first place. And you've shared with me an example, misclassification could be, somebody's behavior appeared deceptive, which we know is a pseudoscience, or maybe a poor eyewitness misidentification. But you shared with me, which I thought was kind of interesting, a way that maybe I got to be careful what kind of watch I'm wearing that may have misclassified me and then put me into a position where I'm being accused of something that I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe you can expand a little bit on what that meant.
Yeah, it's kind of comical if you really think about it. So Osama bin Laden would oftentimes there's photographs of him with a Casio watch. It's a 91 or 92. I forget the version. I used to know the version of this particular watch because I had that same watch. And I guess this watch, it's possible that this could be used like a lot of watches as a timer for a bomb. And if you were a homemade bomb maker. And so a lot of the people, when we were trying to get them transferred or released from Guantanamo, the military interrogators or the analysts were saying they're a member of Al Qaeda because they're wearing the watch. So the watch became an indicator that they represented Al Qaeda. And at the same time, the director of NCIS, Dave Brandt, who is a personal friend of mine, we worked undercover drug operations in the Philippines, and he was a big runner, and he wore that same watch. And so, I told him he needed to be careful he didn't wind up at Guantanamo for
Right.
this particular Casio watch, which is the most popular watch in the world at the time.
But I think it's kind of fascinating how, I mean, I guess we're talking about that story that it seems humorous, but at the end of the day, it's pretty devastating that something like that can put somebody in a situation where they're maybe presumed guilty or presumed involved in some type of crime. We see the same thing, whether it's race, religion, it's belonging to a certain group or whatever it might be, where now there's almost a confirmation bias or tunnel vision that somebody's involved. And for those people that are not watching, I do have my "You Can't Handle the Truth" shirt on today, in recognition of course, one of the best movies of all time, A Few Good Men. But also your time and work at Guantanamo. The second piece to that, and to get back into the book that I referred to, is I know you have had this goal for a long time and have done a lot of work, and both with the chiefs of police and with Higg and variety of other groups, of bringing science into practice. And you've helped collect these groups of experts and authors to put this book together. And there's chapters on, rapport building. There's a handful of chapters on different interview techniques, like the peace model and the Sue technique and the Scharf technique, and which I thought was really neat. So I just wanted to give you a chance, just to kind of let people know maybe where they can access this information, especially since the digital version is free, and maybe what the goal of that book is.
Well, first, let me address A Few Good Men. I agree. Incredible movie, and actually, I know the case agent on the real case. There was actually an NCIS case. A guy named Carl Jones was the case agent on it, and the name is a little different. It's still an Hispanic name. I think one is Alvarez, but anyway, the real victim didn't die. He was assaulted, and he did get the blanket party and all those other things that happened to him. The code red, but it's actually on that. And my deputy assistant director, when I was the assistant director of FLETC, when he was a Marine judge advocate, his job was to go find that case in the archives of the Marine Corps judge advocates records to help look at the case. So it's actually based on
That's pretty neat.
kind
Yeah.
of a true story.
So Lieutenant Caffey and Colonel Jessup and are real people in one way or another.
Yeah, or another. Yes. So let me talk about the interviewing interrogation, because it's an interesting story. So I'm a lifetime member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, and I'm currently a member of the Police Research Advancement Section, and I'm the past chair of the International Managers of Police Academy and College Training Section of the ICP. There's 4-year term limits. I spent 4 years as the chair and the previous 4 years as the vice chair. So for 8 years, I've been involved as either the vice chair or chair of a section of the IACP that deals with police academy and college training. When I first got involved with the high value detainee interrogation group research program, I recognized that this research needed to get in the hands of the practitioners, and I didn't know any of these researchers before then. Being as the chair of the research committee, I got to know these researchers from around the world, the premier experts that the U.S. government was turning to, because when President Obama issued Executive Order 13491 and said we won't torture, what he said was, but we need to know what the most effective methods are to obtain information to protect our national security. So and it had been 50 years, 50 years, since the U.S. government had put any research into this. And so this was looked at as the high value detainee interrogation group was the answer to getting effective and reliable information, right, to protect our national security. Unlike PACE in the UK, which is really driven by human rights, the Higg was driven for effective interviewing that is lawful, right? It had to be lawful. But the real focus was we need to protect our national security, and we need to enable science to do so. And so what I would do is just about every year, I would have some type of, we would usually have about 8 impact section workshops. And every year, as the vice chair or the chair, I would always have one dedicated to research. And I try to invite a research scientist in to talk. Or one point, I had the director of the high value detainee interrogation group, senior executive from the FBI talk. I've had research scientists from the world talk, had the chief of research from the Hague talk. I've given talks. But the real goal was to try to get this research into the hands of practitioners and get the researchers to develop better relationship with the practitioners. And what I found was they go to the conference and then they leave, and those relationships wouldn't continue. They're two different communities. And the problem is there are paywalls for research, right? The research costs money to get, and it's hard to understand. I mean, when I look at these research papers, I give them to a researcher and say, make sure I got this right, explain this to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the good fortune of spending 3 years as a visiting scholar at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So I had 3 years, working with Dr. Maria Hartwig and others there, just studying interrogation. And of course, my time before that at the High Vegetation Interrogation Group, I actually helped instruct some of those early interrogators and interviewers when the Hague was first formed, and have been around the world instructing in effective interviewing. So what we did with the impact section was I formed a subcommittee, and I said we need to understand why this information isn't getting into practice. And the impact section has an executive board. And I brought a couple of people onto the executive board. One is Trond Mikkelbust, who is an assistant chief of the Norwegian Federal Police College University out in Oslo, Norway. Another is Gavin Oxberg, who's a professor at Northumbria University in the UK and a former Royal Air Force police investigator, and Dr. Maria Hartwig from John Jay College. And I said, figure this out, help try to determine kind of why or how we may be able to do this. And they came back with just what I said. Research costs money. These two communities operate in separate silos, and it's hard for practitioners to understand what the research says. And so we set out over the course of 3 or 4 years, identifying more than 50 of what we believed would be the premier researchers and practitioners to put together the volume you're referring to, that anthology, A History of Interrogation Research and Practice Since World War II. And we asked those authors to write it so it's geared towards the practitioner, right? Write it so it's more understandable. We do have a chapter on research methods. So if you want to understand those research methods, you can look at that chapter, but you don't need to then go into all of those things in each separate chapter. And then we set out upon the challenge of trying to make it available for free. And it's hard to get people to do things for free, but
Right.
we did find a publisher who, and initially my goals may have been a little more parochial. Initially, we asked them, is it possible to make the book free to the impact section of the IACP? Because part of that mandate, my charter, my mission as the chair, was to get research at the hands of the practitioners out there, particularly in training academies. And we talked about that with the publisher, and they said, well, every year your membership changes. How do we know who's a member? And then they said, why don't we just make it available to all of IACP? And I said, that's great. And they said, how many members is that? I said, it's about 30,000. And they said, why don't we just make it available free for everybody?
Right.
And so, not intentionally, but fortunately, the entire book, the ebook, the digital version, is totally free of charge as a public service. And so the editors of the book became Gavin Oxberg, Trond Mikkelbust, Dr. Maria Hartwig, and myself, who put this compilation together, and it's out there. And so the whole goal is to try to get this data into the hands of the practitioners who can use it. Now, the good news is it's happening. The goal when I was first appointed to the Higg Research Committee, the thought process was, as this at the high level as this research is done, and then it started to be used on high value detainees, and then it's going to trickle down to all these agencies. That is happening now. And so, as you know, I'm the assistant director for training of the federal, and now they're called centers. But they have totally evolved their interview and interrogation training, and they've abandoned what they call the 5-step approach, was a confession-driven model, and now they teach science-based methods.
No, I was just going to say it's a nice evolution that we've seen federally and local law enforcement. It's not fully embraced yet, but we're seeing that because of a lot of the work of things that you've been a part of: legislative changes, policy changes, bringing academics and practitioners together, which is really kind of the foundation of this podcast, is making sure that we are informing practitioners. Why are we doing what we're doing? And I think that this book is a great way to do that. So I recommend that people look into that. I also know, and I don't want to forget to mention this, but I know you've had a chance a few different times to be behind the bright lights and cameras for some different kind of TV shows or documentaries and insights on things. And I know there's a new one coming out soon, so I recommend people stay tuned. But in early April, I believe ABC Network will have interrogation tapes that you're going to be on a couple episodes, kind of critiquing or supporting one side or the other, some different cases that you saw. And so feel free to kind of give us some more insight to that. And then I want to give you a chance, if you've got maybe kind of one last takeaway or one last truth, that if people fast forwarded to the end of our discussion and they at least left with one thing, what would that be? What do you want people to hear?
Yeah, well, let me first talk about the interrogation tapes show, because I'm excited to see what it turned out like, because you never know when you're in front of that camera what it's going to look like at the end.
Right.
And so ABC News producers came to me and said they had seen me. I had done a thing for Vanity Fair TV where I did an analysis of television and movie versions of interrogation and commented on that. And that's available on YouTube and Vanity Fair TV at no charge as well. But ABC News came to me, and they said my name was given to them by a number of people when they were researching this. And they said, will you take a look at actual real world interrogation tapes and comment on them as an expert? And I do expert witness work for law firms and others, and provide material for mostly defense counsel. And I, since 2016, I have been an interrogation expert for the Military Commissions Defense Organization. So I have quite a bit of time looking at interrogation policy and their practice and videotapes and transcripts. And so, of course, I first asked, do I bill hourly or daily? And they said it was free. And it saddened me a little bit, but it did not dampen my enthusiasm. And so what ABC News has done has taken, they're going to have 6 episodes, and they've taken different actual real world interrogations that they have videotapes of, and then asked experts to comment on them as an expert. So Chris Tapp was one who was convicted of a crime he did not commit, a murder he did not commit. And there were 60 hours, I think, of interrogation tapes that I reviewed of Chris. Another person, Sarah Stern, I looked at those. But I commented on the what looked good, what was beneficial in the interrogations, and what was detrimental to the interrogations. And I know other research scientists are part of this. I know Sajida Bhatt, who I worked with when she was with the high vegetation, she's one of the people commenting on, and others. So it'll air April 1st at 10 p.m. on ABC News. And then the other episode of the 6, I'm in 2 of the 6 episodes, will be May 6th. But they'll air on ABC News at 10 p.m. On those Mondays. And then it'll be available streaming on Hulu. And it's called Interrogation Tapes. And I'm excited because I don't know what the other experts had commented on. So I'm really excited to kind of review those and kind of look at everyone's take on those same interrogation tapes. Now, you asked me for a final thought, and what I would say, particularly looking at the profession, the practice of policing, that we need to kind of look at how society wants us to police. And when I talk to police leaders, I talk about how policing with virtue is a step closer towards community embraced policing.
Yeah, I like that. I think reestablishing the entire mindset and the culture of policing on both sides of the fence, honestly, right? What law enforcement has to deal with today from a societal perspective, but also what they are responsible for. So it's a two-way street, but I think informing through research makes it easier to do so. There's a little more credibility behind what decisions are being made when it's informed and guided by, ethics, law, and of course research. So I think that's a great final thought. I'm looking forward to seeing you on the bright lights. Hopefully they didn't need to use too much makeup, and you look good and natural. But I appreciate your time today. I know you and I could probably talk for several hours about some of these topics. So I recommend, if you're interested in learning more, access at a minimum the free e-version of the book that we discussed. Mark's got a few other publications out I recommend looking at. Mark and I also did a few other recordings that are available for free. We did one discussing the Mendez principles and his involvement and those effective principles adopted by the UN and kind of promoted across the globe. And Mark also did a discussion on his book Unjustifiable Means. So all open access. I recommend you do that to learn more. But thanks, Mark, for joining me. I appreciate our discussion today.
Dave, thanks for all you do to improve the practice of policing and effective interviewing.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely better together, fighting in the same direction. So thanks, Mark, and thank you all for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Landers-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.